The heat in the Virginia Beach bar was thick with the sweat of hard bodies and the cheap perfume of women who liked to dance with danger. It was a Thursday night, the unofficial start of the weekend for the Special Warfare Community, based out of Joint Expeditionary Base, Little Creek Fort, Story. The clientele was predictable: active duty SEALs, support personnel, and the local women who were drawn to the aura of power and secrecy that clung to them like a second skin. She sat alone at the far end of the polished oak bar, a half-empty glass of sparkling water with lime sweating in front of her. To the casual observer, she was an enigma wrapped in business casual. Her name, she'd offer if asked, was Jordan. She had the lean, coiled posture of a long-distance runner with sharp, unintelligent eyes that scanned the room not with the hungry gaze of a predator, but with the quiet assessment of an analyst. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup, a stark contrast to the painted-on faces of the women giggling near the dartboard. At the center of the room, holding court like a pack of alpha wolves, were 4 men from an East Coast-based SEAL team. They were loud, confident, and fueled by cheap beer and the intoxicating knowledge that they belonged to the world's most elite brotherhood. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Dan, was telling a story about a training evolution gone wrong, his voice carrying over the jukebox. So the lieutenant jumps on the comms screaming, "What's the status of the primary breach?" And without missing a beat, Petty Officer Rodriguez goes, "Meet the door's still very much closed, sir. It's winning." The table erupted in laughter, slapping the worn wood. Their eyes eventually drifted toward the end of the bar. A new face, a pretty one, alone. To them, she was fresh prey. Dan, egged on by his buddies, grabbed his beer and ambled over, sliding onto the stool next to her with a practiced grin. "Don't see many new faces around here," he said, his voice a low rumble meant to be seductive. "You must be lost. This is a pretty hardcore crowd." He gestured vaguely toward his table, where his friends were watching with amused interest. Jordan turned to him, her expression neutral. "Am I? I thought it was just a bar." Dan chuckled, leaning in. "It's a SEAL bar. You know, frogmen, the baddest dudes on the planet?" He puffed his chest out slightly. "I'm Dan, by the way. I'm with Team 4. She didn't offer her hand. "Jordan. So, Jordan, what brings a girl like you to a place like this? You look like you work in an office. Lawyer, accountant." He was trying to place her, to find an angle. She was too composed, too calm. It was unnerving. "Something like that," she said, her eyes drifting past him to the table of SEALs. They were loud, boisterous, confident. They were also, she noted with a trained eye, oblivious. They had no peripheral vision, no sense of the room beyond their own reflection in it. They were predators who had forgotten what it was like to be prey. Dan, misinterpreting her gaze for interest, pressed on. "You know, a pretty girl like you shouldn't be drinking alone. Tell you what, my boys and I are heading to a private party later. A bunch of us from the teams. It'd be a real experience for a civilian. You'd get to see how the heroes relax." He winked, a gesture so arrogant it was almost cartoonish. Jordan took a slow sip of her water, letting the silence stretch. She placed the glass down with a soft clink. "Heroes," she repeated, the word flat. "That's an interesting way to put it." Dan's brow furrowed. He wasn't getting the expected reaction. Where was the doe-eyed awe? The flustered giggle? This woman was looking at him as if he were a specimen under a microscope. He decided to change tactics, to hit her with a bit of the mystique. "Look, I can't tell you what I do, obviously. It's classified. But let's just say we operate in the shadows so people like you can sleep safe at night." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. I've been all over the world. Done things you can't imagine. Jordan tilted her head, a flicker of something amusement, pity, crossing her face. You're right, Dan. I can't imagine. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that his bravado lacked. I can't imagine being so loud in a room full of strangers. I can't imagine telling someone I just met about operating in the shadows. And I can't imagine... She paused, letting her eyes drift to his friends, who were now openly staring. I can't imagine having absolutely no idea who I'm actually talking to. The air crackled. Dan's smile faltered. What's that supposed to mean? Jordan reached into her pocket and slid a simple black military-grade identification card across the bar. It didn't have a photo, just a name, a rank, and a naval special warfare insignia. Dan's eyes scanned it, at his brain refusing to process the information for a full 3 seconds. The name wasn't Jordan, and the rank, it wasn't an E something, it was an O something. And the designation, it wasn't a support rate, it was a warfare qualifier. It was the same trident pin he wore on his chest, the symbol of a Navy SEAL. He looked from the card to her face and back again, the color draining from his own. The condescending smirk was gone, replaced by the pale, wide-eyed look of a man who had just realized he'd been aiming a water pistol at a tank. Jordan picked up her card, tucked it away, and stood up. She was slightly shorter than him, but at that moment she seemed to tower over his seated form. The first rule of being a SEAL, Dan, isn't about operating in the shadows. It's about humility. It's about knowing that the moment you think you're the baddest dude in the room is the moment you get yourself or your team killed. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that was colder than the ice in her glass. Tonight, you got lucky. The only thing you compromised was your own dignity. Next time, the person at the end of the bar might not be so forgiving. She turned and walked away, leaving Dan staring at the empty stool, the echo of the jukebox suddenly deafening. His buddies, sensing the shift, came over. Dude, what happened? Who was that? Dan just shook his head, his throat dry. He looked at the door as it swung shut behind her. I have no idea, he mumbled. But she's not who we thought she was. The weapon had been in the room the whole time, and they had been too busy admiring themselves in the mirror to notice. And the news of the incident at O'Malley's, as it was unofficially dubbed, spread through the Team 4 quarters like wildfire. The story was too good, too humiliating not to tell. Dan, the loud, proud frogman, had been systematically taken apart by a woman at the bar who turned out to be one of their own. But the details were fuzzy, and the rumor mill churned out more questions than answers. An operator from the teams? A woman? It was impossible. There were no women in the teams. The very idea was a contradiction in terms. This was the chasm that Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins, known to a select few as Alex, navigated every single day of her life. The reality was far more complex and clandestine than a barroom anecdote. Sarah Jenkins was not a SEAL in the traditional sense, not a member of a conventional team doing direct action missions. She was one of the military's most carefully guarded secrets, a specially selected naval officer, cross-trained to the absolute highest standard and embedded within the intelligence apparatus that supported the most sensitive counterterrorism operations. Her existence was a tightly held secret, known only to a handful of admirals, senior CIA officials, and the commanding officers of the Black Ops units she supported. Her journey to that bar stool began over a decade earlier, not in the brutal surf of basic underwater demolition/SEAL, BUD/S training, but in the hallowed halls of the Naval Academy. She was a prodigy, a Middle East studies major with a near-native fluency in Arabic and Pashto, who also happened to be a Division I swimmer and a three-time All-American in the pentathlon. Her intelligence scores were off the charts, landing her in a category the Navy reserved for its most promising future leaders. After graduation, while her male classmates were being funneled towards the fleet or the Special Operations pipeline, Sarah was approached by a man in a civilian suit who asked her a single, life-altering question. How would you like to serve your country in a way no woman ever has before? She was recruited into a pilot program, so classified it didn't have a real name, only a project number. The concept was radical: to create a new kind of special operator, one who could combine the tactical acumen of a SEAL with the deep cultural understanding and tradecraft of a CIA paramilitary officer. And because of the unique operational environments they were targeting, the tribal regions of Pakistan, the hinterlands of Yemen, the closed societies of the Middle East, they needed someone who could operate in a way a 200-pound man with a crew cut never could. They needed a woman. For 5 years, Sarah Jenkins disappeared. To her family, she was on a series of highly classified diplomatic missions. In reality, she was put through a pipeline that made BUD/S look like a summer camp. She endured the same hell week, the same land navigation, the same weapons and demolition training as every other SEAL candidate. She passed. Then, the real training began. The CIA sent her to the Farm, its covert training facility where she learned the art of spycraft, surveillance, dead drops, recruiting assets, and most importantly, blending in. And she learned to be invisible, to be forgettable, to be the last person anyone would ever suspect of being a lethal weapon. Her missions were the stuff of legend, none of which would ever be declassified. She had walked the streets of Peshawar in a burqa, gathering intelligence on a high-value target. She had posed as a human rights worker in the Balkans to extract a compromised agent. She was the quiet observer in the room, the analyst who could brief a SEAL Team 6 assault force on every detail of a target compound, not just from satellite photos, but from having walked the perimeter herself, disguised as a local man's third wife. The men she worked with never knew her full story. To the DevGru operator she briefed before the Bin Laden raid, she was simply Jen, the brilliant but unassuming CIA analyst who was 100% sure their target was in the compound. They respected her intellect, her intensity, but they saw her as support, not as one of them. And that was exactly how it had to be. Her cover was her weapon. Her anonymity was her armor, but it was a lonely existence. She lived in a world of mirrors, where her greatest achievements had to remain invisible, where she could never correct a man like Dan when he spouted his ignorant, chest-thumping bravado. Until that night in Virginia Beach, something about his casual, condescending arrogance had snapped a tightly wound spring inside her. For the first time in her career, she had shown her hand, just a little, to a stranger. The next morning, sitting in a sterile office at the Dam Neck Annex, she knew she had made a mistake. It was a small one, a minor breach of her own exacting standards. But in her world, small mistakes had a way of cascading. She had let her ego, her frustration at being perpetually underestimated, get the better of her. She had revealed just enough of the truth to be dangerous. Now she could only wait and see if that small error would come back to haunt her. The weapon had been exposed, even if for just a moment, and the smartest thing to do was to assume the enemy had seen it. The error, as Sarah had predicted, did not remain dormant. It metastasized. Dan, his ego battered and his curiosity inflamed, couldn't let it go. He was a bulldog with a bone, and his packmates, initially amused by his humiliation, soon became obsessed with unraveling the mystery. Who was she? The name on the ID card, And the one that wasn't Jordan was real enough to trigger a cascade of quiet, unofficial inquiries. They started with the obvious, checking the official personnel database for her name. It existed, but it was a ghost. Her record was sealed behind more firewalls than the president's daily brief. This only made them more determined. They used friendships with admin personnel, whispered favors, and the unspoken code of the Brotherhood, one SEAL helping another. They were looking for proof that she was a fraud, a wannabe, someone who had stolen an identity. The idea that she was legitimately one of them, a woman who had walked their path, was simply unacceptable. It challenged the very core of their identity. Their digging eventually attracted the wrong kind of attention. A flag went up in the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, office. An unauthorized queries into a highly restricted personnel file. The source was traced back to a cluster of operators at Little Creek. NCIS special agents, well-versed in the intricacies of special warfare, didn't launch a full-scale raid. Instead, they did something far more subtle and effective. They paid a quiet visit to the commanding officer of Team 4. The CO, a grizzled captain with multiple combat tours and a deep disdain for anything that brought negative attention to his command, was furious. He assembled the 4 men in his office, the air thick with tension. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was a low, dangerous whisper that carried more weight than any scream. "Explain to me," he began, his eyes boring into Dan, why I have NCIS agents in my office asking about a security breach originating from men under my command. Dan swallowed hard. "Sir, we were just trying to verify the identity of someone we met. It was an off-duty matter, sir." "An off-duty matter," the CO repeated, the words dripping with contempt. "You are never off-duty. You think your security clearance has working hours? You think operational security punches a clock?" He slammed a folder onto his desk. "The person you were verifying has a higher clearance than any man in this room. Her operational value to this nation is incalculable. And you 4, he pointed a thick finger at each of them in turn. You 4, with your hurt feelings and your bored curiosity, may have just compromised years of work." "She's a woman, sir," one of the other SEALs blurted out, unable to contain himself. "How is that possible?" The CO stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. "You want to know how it's possible? I'll tell you how it's possible. It's possible because while you were busy chugging beers and trying to get laid, she was in a black site in Thailand waterboarding a terrorist for 12 hours straight. It's possible because while you were complaining about the chow at the base galley, she was living in a rat-infested safe house in Damascus for 6 months, alone, without any comms. It's possible because she has done more for this country in the last 5 years than you 4 will do in your entire careers." He leaned forward, his face inches from Dan's. "She is not a woman who is a SEAL. She is a SEAL who happens to be a woman. And she is twice the operator you will ever be." Now get the hell out of my sight." The men shuffled out, humiliated and shaken. They had touched something they didn't understand and had been burned by the fire. The story of the woman at the bar was no longer a joke. It was a cautionary tale, a legend whispered in hushed tones. But for Sarah, the damage was done. The attention was a toxin. A few weeks later, she was pulled from an impending deployment to the Horn of Africa. The official reason was a realignment of operational priorities. The unofficial reason, the one she could read in the concerned eyes of her handler, was that her cover had been too badly compromised. The loose lips of a few arrogant SEALs in a bar had created a ripple that could, theoretically, reach the ears of a hostile intelligence service. The weapon had been seen. Its unique properties were now known. It was no longer deniable, no longer invisible. She was offered a new assignment, a desk job at the Pentagon, a promotion, they called it, a chance to shape the next generation of operators. To Sarah, it felt like a cage. They were clipping her wings, grounding the eagle, because a few sparrows had noticed she could fly. The error had not been hers at the bar. The error was the system's failure to keep its own secrets. The failure of men like Dan to understand that the battlefield was no longer just a dusty field in Afghanistan, but a global landscape where the most potent weapon could be a quiet woman with a graduate degree and a will of steel. The invitation came via a sealed envelope delivered to her new office in the Pentagon's E-ring. It was heavy, cream-colored cardstock, a stark contrast to the beige. A government issue everything that surrounded her. There was no return address, only her name, Sarah Jenkins, and a date and time. Inside, a simple handwritten line. A gathering of old friends, no more shadows. She knew what it was immediately. Despite the official policy, despite the secrecy, there were others. Men and women who operated in the spaces between, who had served in the shadows alongside her. They were the enablers, the intelligence analysts, the support personnel, the other quiet professionals who made the magic happen. They were her real tribe, and they were reaching out to her. The gathering was at a private farmhouse in the Virginia countryside, hours from the D.C. Beltway. As she pulled her rental car up the long gravel drive, she saw a collection of ordinary vehicles, sedans, SUVs, a pickup truck, and nothing that would draw a second glance. Inside, the scene was different. The living room was filled with people she knew, their faces relaxed, their laughter genuine for the first time in her memory. She saw Jen, the CIA analyst from the Bin Laden raid, looking less intense, without the weight of the world on her shoulders. She saw a man she only knew as Owen, a retired DEVGRU operator whose book had caused such a stir, now living openly, his disguise shed. She saw other familiar faces from various agencies and units, all bound by the shared experience of operating in a world of secrets. A woman with close-cropped gray hair and a warrior's bearing approached her, a glass of wine in her hand. It took Sarah a moment to place her. Kristen Beck. As a former SEAL who had served for 20 years as Chris Beck before coming out as transgender. Their paths had never crossed operationally, but Sarah knew her story intimately. It was another variation of the same theme, the struggle to be one's true self in an institution built on a very narrow definition of strength. "Sarah," Kristen said, her voice warm, "I'm so glad you came. I heard about what happened, the incident at the bar." She smiled, a knowing, slightly sad smile. "It's always the little things, isn't it? The one moment you decide to be human, and the whole house of cards comes down." Sarah accepted the wine, feeling a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for months begin to ease. "I keep replaying it. If I had just kept my mouth shut, ignored him, I'd be in theater right now." "Or maybe not," Kristen countered. "Maybe it would have been something else, a slip of the tongue in a briefing, a former asset who recognized you in a market. We dance on the edge of a razor every single day. The fall isn't a matter of if, it's a matter of when. The only question is what you do after you pick yourself up." The evening was a revelation. Sarah heard stories of incredible valor from people whose names would never be on a monument. She heard of quiet sacrifices made by spouses and children who could never know the full truth. She heard laughter, real, deep laughter, as they traded stories not of gunfights and explosions, but of the absurdities of their hidden lives. The time an analyst had to pretend to be a geologist's wife in a remote Mongolian village for 3 months. Or the time a piece of spycraft equipment malfunctioned in the middle of a handoff in a crowded Cairo market, looking for all the world like a malfunctioning sex toy. It was a form of therapy, this gathering, a chance to de-stress, to be known, to be seen. For years, Sarah had defined herself by her mission, by her ability to disappear. Now, for the first time, she was being asked to simply exist, to be Sarah Jenkins, not Alex, not the analyst, not the legend. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Later that night, she stood on the farmhouse porch, looking out at the star-dusted sky. Kristen joined her, leaning against the railing. "What now?" Sarah asked, the question hanging in the cold night air. Kristen shrugged. "Whatever you want. The world is a lot bigger than the teams. There are other battles to fight. You could train the next generation of quiet professionals, teach them to avoid the traps we fell into. You could write, speak, advocate for a more inclusive military, one that doesn't see diversity as a weakness, but as an operational advantage. Or, she said, turning to look at Sarah with a glint in her eye, you could just go live your life. Find out who you are when you're not wearing a mask." Sarah thought about Dan, about his arrogance and his ignorance. She thought about the CO who had defended her, who had seen her value. She thought about the long, lonely years of silence. The weapon had been forged in secrecy, honed in the shadows, and ultimately blunted by the very institution that created it. But she was not just a weapon. She was a person. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The legend wasn't just about the one weapon and the one error. It was about the woman who survived both and who was finally learning to live without them.